Part 1, The Hook and Thesis. The consensus question. Satoshi Kon's Paprika is frequently categorized as a psychedelic caper about the dangers of unchecked technology, specifically the encroachment of digital spaces upon human consciousness. This reading positions the DC Mini, the device allowing practitioners to enter dreams, as a tool of corporate hubris, framed by the familiar narrative arc of the ethical scientist battling a power-hungry executive. Yet, this consensus misses the film's deeper architecture. Paprika is not a warning about technology, it is an examination of the dissolution of the ego within a collective unconscious. Through its seamless transitions between the waking world and the dreamscape, the film posits that reality is not a fixed, objective environment, but a consensus-based projection maintained by the fragile boundaries of the individual psyche. The world of Paprika functions on the permeability of the barrier between the biological self and the digital environment. In this society, technology serves as an extension of the internal landscape rather than a separate, external entity. The DC Mini represents the removal of the final lock on the human mind, turning thoughts, fears, and memories into tangible, shareable commodities. Within this structure, labor is redefined. The psychotherapist is no longer a guide for the patient, but an architect of the patient's cognitive architecture. The architectural geography of the film reflects this. The clinical, sterile office spaces occupied by Dr. Atsuko Chiba are rapidly invaded by the chaotic, colorful, and organic imagery of the dream world, suggesting that the baseline of reality is merely a temporary silence before the eruption of the repressed subconscious. At the center of this dissolution is the relationship between the grounded, emotionally detached Atsuko and her vibrant, manifestations-driven avatar, Paprika. The conflict within the film is not the theft of a device, but the integration of a fractured self. Atsuko's trauma is stored in her inability to reconcile her professional identity with her desire for spontaneity and emotional connection. The film treats the dream world as a somatic environment where repressed impulses, the shadow, are given physical form. The antagonist, Chairman Inui, is the ultimate agent of this structural breakdown. He operates from the belief that human dreams are a source of chaos that must be suppressed or controlled, failing to realize that by attempting to colonize the dream world, he has merely accelerated the collapse of the barrier between his own rigid ideology and the limitless, creative volatility of the collective mind. The film's visual language is the primary tool for this exploration. Kon uses match cuts and fluid transitions to bypass the traditional logic of editing, forcing the audience to occupy the same epistemological space as the characters. A chair becomes a horse, a desk becomes a cliff, and a cityscape becomes a parade of consumerist detritus. These shifts are not mere surrealist flourishes, they are visual representations of the instability of identity. The camera's movement, often sweeping and kinetic, treats the environment as a living, breathing participant that mirrors the character's internal states. As the dream world bleeds into the waking world, the film's color palette shifts from the muted, intellectual tones of the research facility to the hypersaturated, cacophonous visuals of the subconscious, visually validating the idea that the internal life possesses more truth than the regulated exterior. Philosophically, Paprika adopts an existential stance. It refuses to frame the merging of realities as a catastrophic loss of control. Instead, it presents the collective dream as a necessary evolution of human discourse. When the boundaries between individuals are erased, language, long a tool of the rational state, is rendered insufficient. Characters communicate through symbols, archetypes, and raw emotional resonance, bypassing the limitations of logical articulation. The film argues that true agency is found not by clinging to the ego, but by embracing the fluidity of one's own psyche within the larger, shared existence. The final integration of Atsuko and Paprika serves as the ultimate proof of this synthesis. The individual becomes stronger by accepting their capacity for change and connection. Technologically, Paprika remains a masterclass in the integration of the synthetic and the organic. The digital animation does not merely simulate reality, it transcends it to map the contours of the human imagination. The parade sequence, with its grotesque and beautiful accumulation of cultural icons, serves as a poignant reminder that we are all, in part, products of our consumption and our environment. By blending traditional cel-shaded aesthetics with complex digital compositing, the film achieves a texture that feels tactile yet ethereal. This technical ambition serves the thesis perfectly. If our reality is constructed from the data of our experiences and the myths of our culture, then a medium that can seamlessly blend these elements is the only honest way to represent the human condition. Ultimately, Paprika avoids the cautionary tale trap by focusing on the transformative potential of the dream. It does not demand that we retreat from our creations or fear the intrusion of the digital. Instead, it invites the viewer to recognize that the barriers they build to protect their sanity are often the very things that alienate them from their own humanity. The film leaves the audience in a state of suspended realization, where the distinction between the observer and the observed is rendered irrelevant. The struggle for identity is not resolved by the victory of one side over another, but by the quiet, profound realization that the self is an open, interconnected, and infinite process, forever weaving its own meaning into the fabric of the collective. The subversion question. Satoshi Kon's Paprika is frequently categorized as a psychedelic exploration of the subconscious, a dizzying dive into the fluid nature of dreams. However, the film is a precise diagnostic of the commodification of the human psyche. The popular consensus views the DC Mini, the device allowing therapists to enter dreams, as a tool for exploration. In reality, Paprika serves as an indictment of the erasure of individual interiority in favor of a homogenized, marketable collective consciousness. The film argues that in a hypercapitalist society, the dream space is not a sanctuary for the unconscious, but the final, untapped frontier for corporate expansion. The world of Paprika functions on the conversion of biological subjective experience into digital data. This technology is the ultimate instrument of capital. It transforms the erratic, unruly, and deeply personal landscape of the human mind into a navigable, standardized product. The normal reality portrayed in the film is already suffocatingly structured, characterized by rigid corporate hierarchies and the stifling of individual desire. When the dream world collapses into the waking world, it is not a chaotic intrusion of magic, but the systemic leakage of repressed labor and discarded emotions. The visual geography of the film, which frequently blends high-tech clinical environments with grotesque, parade-like manifestations of mass-market consumer culture, demonstrates that the subconscious has been colonized by the same cultural detritus that dominates the waking hours. At the center of this tension is Dr. Atsuko Chiba and her avatar, Paprika. While Atsuko represents the constrained, rationalized ego, Paprika embodies the fluid potential of the liberated psyche. Their existence highlights a profound epistemic fracture. The society in Paprika prizes the efficiency of the DC Mini over the validity of the human subject. The trauma inherent in the film is not merely a backstory for its characters, it is a symptom of a reality that demands the fragmentation of the self. Characters like Detective Konakawa, who is haunted by his abandoned creative ambitions, are trapped in a repetition compulsion, constantly reenacting their past failures within the dream space. The technology offers them no catharsis, only a high-definition mirror of their own stagnation. The film's central antagonist, Chairman Inui, is not a traditional villain motivated by malice, but a quintessential technocratic pragmatist. His vision of a unified dream world is the logical conclusion of the film's capital-driven premise. By merging individual dreams into a singular, controlled narrative, he seeks to abolish the unpredictability of human difference. This desire for order is the ultimate expression of the system's fear of the unmediated, non-commodifiable self. In this light, the parade, the film's most iconic and chaotic visual sequence, is not merely a manifestation of madness. It is a visual representation of the hyper-consumerist machine, a relentless, non-stop flow of commodities and cultural icons that have successfully assimilated the dreams of the populace. Technically, Kon uses the medium of animation to reflect this total collapse of boundaries. The film's fluid editing and constant spatial transformation simulate a state where the distinction between objective reality and subjective fantasy has dissolved. Because the characters move through environments that are physically impossible, the film denies the viewer the comfort of a stable anchor, forcing an engagement with the instability of the characters' own identities. The sound design complements this, utilizing jarring shifts between the sterile, clinical hum of the lab and the deafening, carnival-like cacophony of the dream world, reinforcing the sense of an encroaching, inescapable synthetic tide. The final synthesis of the film offers a perspective on the survival of the individual within a system that seeks to consume the entirety of the inner life. When Atsuko and Paprika finally converge, it is not a return to a pre-technological state of grace, but an act of assertion. The individual must navigate the ruins of their own constructed identity, acknowledging the shadow self and the impact of the tools they have created. The struggle depicted is not against a specific external force, but against the inherent tendency of modern societal structures to dissolve the human interior into a coherent, manageable, and ultimately lifeless whole. Ultimately, Paprika stands as a radical critique of the digital age's promise of total connectivity. It suggests that when the barriers between individuals are removed, the result is not collective empathy, but a profound loss of the self. The film refuses to provide a comfortable resolution. The technology remains, the corporations remain, and the psychological imprint of the events persists. The viewer is left with the realization that the most dangerous frontier is not the dream, but the waking world that creates the conditions for such a dream to exist. The legacy of Paprika lies in its insistence that true agency is found in the protection of one's internal chaos against the forces that seek to order, monetize, and inevitably destroy it. The anomaly question. Paprika functions as a profound investigation into the permeability of the human subconscious, positing that reality is not an objective constant but a collective hallucination sustained by our shared desires, fears, and linguistic constructs. The film presents the DC Mini, a device capable of recording and traversing dreams, not merely as a technological marvel but as the definitive tool for the dissolution of the ego. By allowing the boundaries between the private interior life and the public sphere to collapse, the film argues that the psyche is the final, untamable frontier of human experience. The central conflict arises when this frontier is weaponized, proving that when the mechanisms of the subconscious are commodified or hijacked, the resulting chaos is not a corruption of reality but an amplification of the repressed truths individuals refuse to acknowledge in their waking hours. The world of Paprika is defined by a frantic, technocratic drive toward the total integration of data and consciousness. Within the Foundation for Psychiatric Research, the DC Mini serves as the ultimate instrument of both healing and observation, yet its existence creates a void where traditional authority fails to maintain control. The film portrays a society deeply invested in the curation of normalcy, where individuals like Detective Toshimi Konakawa grapple with the friction between their professional identities and the disjointed, unresolved fragments of their personal pasts. This baseline reality is constantly threatened by the intrusion of dream logic, a fluid, kaleidoscopic force that ignores the rigid hierarchies of architecture and physics to expose the underlying decay of the characters' internal narratives. The brilliance of the film lies in its refusal to treat the dream world as a secondary or inferior layer of existence. Instead, the dream is the raw data of the soul. As the borders between dream and reality erode, characters are forced into a state of epistemic crisis where their perception of the self becomes malleable. The protagonist, Atsuko Chiba, and her avatar, Paprika, exist as a dual-natured entity, embodying the psychological split between the structured, controlled persona and the liberated, transformative essence. Their journey is a continuous process of reconciliation. When the villain, Chairman Shima, attempts to impose his singular, distorted vision of order upon the collective dream, he acts as the embodiment of the very desire for control that prevents humanity from integrating its own trauma. His collapse is an inevitable consequence of attempting to weaponize the fluidity of the unconscious for static, authoritarian ends. Technically, the film utilizes an aggressive visual language to mirror this psychological fragmentation. The animation prioritizes a sense of constant, metamorphic movement, where the transition between a cityscape and a carnival of anthropomorphic junk is seamless, signaling that the environment is merely an extension of the observer's mind. The synthesis of traditional cel-shaded depth and surrealist imagery acts as a medium for the film's thesis that reality is the sum of our cognitive projections. Sound design further cements this, as the score's repetitive, infectious motifs bleed into the diegetic environment, acting as an invasive, rhythmic pulse that mirrors the relentless nature of the subconscious. The visual complexity of the parade sequence, in particular, does not exist for mere spectacle. It is an organized, chaotic inventory of humanity's anxieties, consumption habits, and fleeting desires, all rendered into a single, cohesive, and terrifying image. Ultimately, the film arrives at a conclusion of existential integration rather than destruction. By the final act, the survival of the characters depends on their willingness to embrace the chaotic potential of their own psyche. The destruction of the artificial barriers between the individual and the collective is not presented as an apocalypse, but as a necessary shift toward a more honest form of existence. The film's legacy remains its insistence that the struggle to define one's selfhood within the noise of a mediated, hyperconnected world is the defining task of the human condition. It captures the tension between the desire for a stable, shared truth and the chaotic, deeply personal nature of consciousness. Through its masterful manipulation of form and narrative, the film successfully argues that the dream is not a flight from the world, but a deeper, more urgent engagement with the fundamental truths of our existence, proving that when the facade of the social order finally shatters, the only thing remaining is the truth we have been hiding from ourselves. The synthesis question. Paprika functions as a profound visual manifesto asserting that the collective unconscious is not a chaotic void, but a shared, high-fidelity infrastructure where human identity is both constructed and liberated. While surface-level readings position the film as a cautionary tale regarding the misuse of technological invention, Paprika argues that the DC Mini is not a destructive force but a necessary catalyst for the total dismantling of the ego. The film's central anomaly, the relentless, kaleidoscopic parade of discarded household objects, religious idols, and media figures, serves as the objective proof that reality and fantasy are chemically identical within the human psyche. The world of Paprika operates through a rigid sociological hierarchy where the waking world functions as a sterile, clockwork environment of corporate control and clinical isolation. Detective Toshimi Konakawa represents the psychological baseline of this society. He is a man shackled by a past-tense dream of filmmaking that he has suppressed in favor of the orderly, grey reality of police work. The DC Mini, while ostensibly a therapeutic tool, serves as the economic engine that exposes the fragility of this social order. It acts as an equalizer, allowing the repressed desires of the individual to manifest as physical terrain, thereby rendering the distinction between the internal self and the externals of world meaningless. Satoshi Kon utilizes the architecture of the dream world to illustrate a direct collapse of the Cartesian divide. The film's visual language relies heavily on seamless, non-Euclidean geometry and fluid, morphing animation that refuses to respect the boundaries of physics. In the sequences where the dream world bleeds into the waking world, the production design intentionally dissolves the distinction between the corporate offices and the dreamscape, proving that reality is merely a consensus hallucination held together by the same structures of belief that govern our dreams. The film demonstrates that the human ego is a fragile, self-imposed prison and that the catastrophic collapse of order caused by the dream terrorist is actually a liberating explosion of potential. The antagonist, Chairman Inui, represents the rigid, authoritarian desire to enforce a singular, static version of reality, viewing the chaos of the unconscious as a threat to progress. However, his failure confirms the film's core philosophical stance: existence cannot be curated. The protagonist, Atsuko Chiba, finds her true self only by merging with her avatar, Paprika. This is not a transition from one state to another, but the realization that both are integral components of a unified whole. Her psychological healing is achieved not through the suppression of her trauma, but through the active, conscious integration of her fractured identities. Technically, the film acts as a meta-commentary on the art of animation itself. By using the boundless, frame-by-frame malleability of anime to depict the fluidity of dreams, the film forces the viewer to confront the artificiality of their own perspective. The editing rhythm accelerates in tandem with the character's loss of internal control, utilizing jarring cuts and overlapping soundscapes to simulate a state of hyperreality. The climactic parade, a cacophony of images that defies traditional narrative logic, serves as the definitive visual proof of the thesis. It is the moment where the private internal world of the characters becomes a public spectacle, proving that language, symbols, and desires are not held internally but are communal, circulating resources. Ultimately, Paprika posits that the struggle to define a boundary between the self and the collective is the primary source of human suffering. The film concludes not with the restoration of the status quo, but with a complete acceptance of the amorphous, fluid nature of existence. The boundary between the dream and the waking world is not repaired, it is discarded. By the final frame, the characters exist within a landscape where their internal lives and external reality occupy the same space, confirming that the only true agency available to the individual is the decision to participate in the dream rather than fear it. Through its radical rejection of binary structures, Paprika asserts that the human experience is only authentic when it abandons the illusion of a fixed, stable self, embracing instead the constant, transformative motion of the collective unconscious. Part 2. Context and World Building. Systems, Scarcity, and Capital. Satoshi Kon's Paprika presents a world where the fundamental currency is not capital, but the raw, unfiltered interiority of the human psyche. The DC Mini, a device capable of recording and projecting dreams, functions as a technological gateway into the subconscious, transforming the mind from a private sanctuary into a commodity. This control is visualized through the sleek, clinical aesthetic of the Psychiatric Research Institute, where the DC Mini is treated as a high-tier medical advancement. However, the film illustrates that the monopoly on this psychic resource is precarious, as the technology intended to heal the fractured self becomes a vector for the total dissolution of individual boundaries. The institutional power held by Dr. Shima and his team is quickly eclipsed by the unchecked, chaotic proliferation of the technology, turning the internal landscape into a public thoroughfare. The black market of this society thrives on the illicit consumption of dream states, revealing a populace desperate to outsource their personal struggles. Because the dream world is effectively an unmapped territory, its commodification creates an economy where identity becomes liquid. The shadows of the film are filled with users seeking an escape from the sterile monotony of their waking lives, trading their sobriety for the vivid, dangerous freedom of the dream. This reliance on the dream state highlights a profound repression. The citizens are unable to process their trauma or existential anxieties within the rigid structures of their waking reality, leading them to seek relief in a digital environment where the laws of physics and morality are suspended. Labor in this world is redefined as the act of dream integration. Doctors, technicians, and patients perform a specific type of emotional labor that requires them to inhabit the subconscious of others, essentially turning their own consciousness into a vessel for alien memories and desires. The body itself remains anchored in the physical world, but its value is tethered entirely to the health and stability of the mind. As the boundaries between the real and the imaginary collapse, the value of the physical self diminishes, replaced by a hypermediated existence where only the most vivid projection carries weight. The struggle to maintain a coherent ego against the tides of the dream parade illustrates that consciousness is the only asset that matters, yet it is also the most fragile. Technological gatekeeping is exerted by those who define the rules of the dream space, effectively policing the subconscious. While the research team possesses the sophisticated interface of the DC Mini, the inevitable leak of this tech into the hands of the unstable proves that such gatekeeping is an illusion. The chaos that ensues demonstrates that when the means of projecting one's internal state become accessible to everyone, the distinction between the expert and the amateur vanishes. The film suggests that there is no elite tier of dreamers, there is only the collective, drowning in the unchecked noise of their own repressed thoughts. The baseline normal in Paprika is a state of quiet, corporate-managed stability. A typical Tuesday consists of researchers navigating sterile, brightly lit offices, meticulously documenting the dream data of patients who are essentially prisoners of their own malaise. This world relies on the repression of the irrational to function. The mundane professionalism of Dr. Atsuko Chiba is the engine that keeps the psychological chaos at bay. By establishing this baseline of professional order, Kon makes the subsequent intrusion of the surreal not just a spectacle, but a violent rupture of the societal contract. The disruption is meaningful precisely because it tears apart the thin, bureaucratic veil that separates the productive, disciplined worker from the chaotic, libidinal force of the collective dream, proving that reality is merely a fragile consensus held together by the suppression of our most unpredictable impulses. Architecture and the visual geography. Paprika establishes a visual geography where the physical world serves as a rigid, crumbling foundation for a fluid, encroaching dreamscape. The film constructs an architectural hierarchy that places corporate elites in sterile, high-altitude laboratories, while the vast majority of characters drift through urban environments characterized by dense, claustrophobic layering. These structures are not merely static backdrops, they represent the calcification of institutional order, manifesting as stark, monochromatic corridors and laboratories that demand uniformity. In contrast, the dream world acts as a radical, organic rupture, where the reality of the waking world is defined by geometry, verticality, and hard edges. The landscape of the dream is defined by constant, erratic metamorphosis. Architecture in the dreamscape behaves like a living organism, folding in on itself, shifting scales, and dissolving the boundaries between interior and exterior spaces. This visual friction serves to highlight the instability of a reality that attempts to commodify the unconscious. The film intentionally showcases the decay of the physical environment as a testament to the stagnation of the status quo. The city is portrayed as a dense labyrinth of signage, narrow alleys, and overlapping infrastructures, suggesting a society that has become overwhelmed by its own technological density. This geography of navigation is intentionally chaotic. Characters are frequently tracked moving through cramped spaces, emphasizing their entrapment within the rigid grid of corporate life. The visual language of these transit spaces, the subway, the office hallways, the hospital corridors, is one of extreme linearity, which serves to make the eventual descent into the surreal dream state feel like a violent liberation of form. By contrasting the cold, decaying stillness of the physical cityscape with the vibrant, recursive chaos of the dream, the film visualizes the struggle of the individual human consciousness trying to maintain its shape within a systemic, technological cage. The VFX of scale functions as the primary tool to illustrate the insignificance of the individual against the sheer magnitude of the dream technology infrastructure. Wide shots often present the city or the dream mass as a sprawling, uncontrollable entity, utilizing deep compositing and procedural layering to overwhelm the viewer's perspective. When the dream begins to bleed into reality, the architecture loses its structural integrity entirely, replaced by massive, flowing parades and surrealist collages that dwarf the human figures within them. This shifting scale is central to the film's portrayal of a world losing its grip on objective truth. The architecture acts as the baseline for order, and as that architecture physically liquefies, the film demonstrates the vulnerability of a reality built upon intellectual property and controlled information. The dream is not merely an escape from this environment, it is the ultimate realization of what happens when the rigid, exclusionary structures of a corporate-controlled society are dismantled by the collective, unbridled subconscious of the masses. The visual geography of Paprika thus reinforces the argument that reality and dreams are not distinct territories, but two sides of the same collapsing structure, where the individual is perpetually forced to navigate the ruins of their own constructed order. Epistemology, information, and society. Paprika serves as a profound inquiry into the fragility of objective reality when confronted by the boundless architecture of human consciousness. The film posits that the boundaries between individual identity and collective experience are not fixed pillars but fluid constructs, susceptible to radical reconfiguration through the mediation of technology. At its core, the film argues that the true danger of the DC Mini, a device capable of navigating the subconscious, lies not in the potential for psychological trauma, but in the total erasure of the distinction between the self and the external world. By dissolving the barriers of the private mind, the film suggests that reality is a consensus-based performance, one that requires consistent, individual maintenance to prevent it from collapsing into a chaotic, pluralistic fever dream. The world of Paprika is one where information has bypassed the physical realm to become the primary geography of human existence. The DC Mini represents the ultimate democratization of the subconscious, transforming the interior life into a navigable, shared space. In this environment, the epistemology of the characters undergoes a fundamental shift. Truth ceases to be an immutable physical fact and becomes a shifting, reactive state governed by the whims of the dreamer. The ruling class attempts to maintain order through the propaganda of scientific objectivity, framing the DC Mini as a control tool for therapy and progress. However, this is a calculated deception. The film's visual evidence reveals that the official narrative of a stable, therapeutic society is a thin veneer stretched over a volatile reality where the repressed desires of the masses constantly threaten to breach the surface. In this hyperconnected landscape, information is processed as a flood of raw, uncontextualized sensory data. The society in Paprika is effectively drowning in its own subconscious noise. The official history of technological progress, touted by the researchers at the Institute for Psychiatric Research, hides the reality that they have created a medium where knowledge is inseparable from the individual's trauma. The outgroups in this world are not merely social exiles, they are those whose internal narratives have been completely swallowed by the collective. Dr. Atsuko Chiba represents the state's attempt to exert control over this chaos, operating with a rigid, professional detachment that serves as an ideological apparatus designed to police the borders of the ego. The film masterfully deconstructs the meta-narrative of the self. Characters like Detective Konakawa suffer from a fracture in their epistemic foundation because their understanding of their own histories is mediated by recurring, unresolved nightmares. These traumas are not abstract, they are somatic memories that exist as literal, physical threats within the dreamscape. The film demonstrates that when the barrier between the psyche and the world is removed, the protagonist's core wound becomes the primary engine of their reality. Konakawa's inability to reconcile his past as a failed artist with his present as a hard-boiled lawman forces him to confront his shadow, manifesting as the recurring cinematic motifs that haunt his dreams. Technically, the film employs a visual language of radical fluidity to mirror this breakdown of boundaries. The animation style does not merely depict dreams, it mimics the logic of the subconscious through relentless, morphing transitions and the surreal layering of space. The VFX work here functions as a narrative tool to isolate characters within their own psychological failures, juxtaposing the sterility of the lab against the carnival-like excess of the dream world. Friction, law, and the catalyst. Paprika operates as a profound exploration of the fragility of the human psyche when confronted with the weaponization of the subconscious. At its core, the film argues that the collapse of the barrier between collective dreamscapes and waking life represents the final stage of technological encroachment upon the human soul. While superficial readings might categorize the film as a thriller involving a stolen piece of technology, Paprika functions as a complex meditation on the erosion of the singular self within a world where private thought is commodified and mass-produced. The synthesis of Satoshi Kon's fractured narrative structure, the fluidity of high-fidelity animation, and the psychological weight of its characters reveals a world where the dream is no longer a sanctuary, but a mirror reflecting the unchecked desires and repressed traumas of a society drowning in its own connectivity. In this reality, the DC Mini represents the ultimate technological tipping point. The device bridges the gap between therapist and patient, allowing for the direct manipulation of the dream state. Corporate interests, specifically the psychiatric research facility overseeing the project, function as the primary architects of this environment, effectively eclipsing governmental authority by managing the fundamental currency of human existence, internal reality. The film depicts a society where the boundaries of the self are constantly negotiated through digital interfaces, and the normal baseline is a state of perpetual, hyper-connected anxiety. When the DC Mini is stolen, it triggers a systemic failure. The subsequent merging of disparate dreams into a singular, chaotic phantasmagoria is not merely a malfunction of the technology but an inevitable consequence of a system that attempted to standardize the inherently irrational nature of the human imagination. The human element is anchored by Atsuko Chiba, a researcher whose bifurcated identity manifests as the titular Paprika. Her psychological journey constitutes a direct engagement with the Jungian shadow, where Paprika serves as the vibrant, uninhibited projection of the repressed elements of Atsuko's clinical, restrained ego. This internal fracture mirrors the film's wider epistemological instability. Atsuko is forced to confront the reality that her own professional contributions, designed to facilitate healing, have become the primary instruments of psychic disintegration. The villain, Detective Toshimi Konakawa, and the institutional figures surrounding them, exist within a framework where the individual is treated as data to be mined. The trauma fueling the narrative is rooted in a collective failure to acknowledge that the pursuit of total psychic access leads to the erasure of the private sanctuary. Visually, the film utilizes the medium of animation to defy the traditional laws of physics, creating a spatial language where the environment constantly shifts to match the psychological instability of the dreamers. The cinematography creates a sense of vertigo, guiding the audience through a kaleidoscopic landscape that feels both deeply intimate and terrifyingly vast. The VFX do not merely decorate the screen, they provide the tactile texture of the psyche itself. Sound design plays a crucial role in blurring the distinction between reality and hallucination, often layering surreal motifs over mundane settings to suggest that the dream state is constantly bleeding into the physical world. This synthesis of craft results in a sensory experience that forces the viewer to share in the protagonist's existential disorientation. Ultimately, Paprika concludes by asserting that the integration of the fractured self, the reconciliation of the clinical observer with the dream self, is the only viable response to a world consumed by hyperreality. The film does not advocate for the abandonment of technology, but for an awareness of the cost of total transparency. The final resolution suggests that while systems of control and corporate interests will continue to attempt to colonize the interiority of the human experience, the innate absurdity and creative power of the dream state remain inherently ungovernable. Paprika leaves the viewer with the understanding that the struggle to maintain one's own reality is a continuous, necessary act of resistance. By the final frame, the film has moved from a critique of scientific hubris to an affirmation of the human capacity to construct meaning, even when the structures designed to sustain that meaning have been irrevocably shattered. The legacy of Paprika resides in its insistence that the human experience is not a static state to be measured or analyzed, but a dynamic, dreamlike process that requires the courage to inhabit both the harsh light of reality and the chaotic, transformative depth of the subconscious. Part 3: The Human Element. Epistemology and the Metanarrative of the Self. The journey of Dr. Atsuko Chiba in Paprika is defined by a profound epistemic fracture, a moment where the boundary between the observer and the observed dissolves entirely. As she navigates the psychological landscape of the DC Mini, the film posits that the self is not a singular, immutable core, but a composite construct vulnerable to external infiltration. When Chiba confronts the reality that her professional detachment, her clinical, stoic real self, is merely a mirror image of the chaotic, uninhibited Paprika, she experiences a fundamental collapse of identity. This realization occurs as the dream world bleeds into the waking city, stripping away the comfort of the analytical distance she has painstakingly maintained. She reacts not with the expected terror of losing one's mind, but with the dawning awareness that her intellectual control was always a performative fiction, a rigid exoskeleton designed to contain her own repressed desires. The discourse within the film reveals a sharp disconnect between verbal expression and internal reality. Dr. Chiba operates within a professional vocabulary of scientific advancement, risk assessment, and technological boundaries, yet her silence speaks to a profound yearning for the fluidity represented by Paprika. She is incapable of voicing her own fragmentation because the lexicon of her society, a world obsessed with the democratization of dreams and the optimization of the human psyche, provides no framework for the integration of contradictory selves. Her dialogue serves as an ideological barrier, a shield of jargon that she uses to keep her inner turmoil at bay, while her actions consistently gravitate toward the very dissolution she claims to fear. This struggle with the limits of language forces Chiba to confront the insufficiency of her own ego. The society she inhabits prioritizes a rationalist, Cartesian understanding of the mind, categorizing human consciousness as data to be managed. Chiba, acting as a custodian of this clinical order, finds herself trapped by the restrictive language of her profession, which views the subconscious as a glitch in the system rather than a vital component of the human experience. Because she lacks the vocabulary to articulate the necessity of her own shadow, she remains tethered to a diagnostic view of her trauma, unable to process it as anything other than a professional failing. The moment of peak cognitive dissonance arrives when Chiba acts to suppress the dream state with the same cold, technical indifference she applies to her machines, even as she feels the pull of the dream consuming her. She justifies this behavior by anchoring herself to the fabricated ego of the responsible researcher, a narrative that allows her to maintain a semblance of control while her internal reality is being rewritten. This narrative of professional duty acts as a psychic anchor, preventing her from acknowledging that her desire for agency is the very engine driving the collapse of the dream world. Ultimately, the fabricated ego of Dr. Chiba is revealed as a defensive construct, an artificial boundary intended to isolate the self from the collective subconscious. The film argues that this self-conception is a survival mechanism, allowing the individual to function in a world where the psyche is increasingly commodified and monitored. By the conclusion, the merging of Chiba and Paprika represents the final abandonment of this fragmented metanarrative. She accepts that she is neither the cold, objective scientist nor the playful, dream-born entity, but the totality of these experiences. The destruction of her ego is not a loss of self, but an expansion, signifying the end of a long, performative struggle to separate the internal landscape from the external world. Trauma and somatic experiencing. The psychological landscape of Paprika serves as a profound examination of how unresolved trauma manifests within the human body, operating far beneath the surface of its vibrant, dream-logic visuals. At the heart of the narrative is Dr. Atsuko Chiba, a character defined by a rigid, compartmentalized existence. Her foundational trauma is rooted in the suppression of her own capacity for play, vulnerability, and integration. Chiba's ego is constructed as a fortress of professional efficiency, a defense mechanism designed to quarantine the chaotic, multifaceted nature of her psyche behind the clinical persona of a researcher. The film carefully preserves this central wound, keeping the distance between her waking self and her dream manifestation, Paprika, as a source of mounting tension until the final act, where the two identities must inevitably collide to achieve psychic wholeness. This trauma is not merely an abstract cognitive conflict but is expressed through deep somatic memory. Chiba's body acts as a vessel for her repressed emotions, with the DC Mini technology functioning as a literal extension of her internal dissonance. The physical manifestation of this tension is found in her inability to bridge the gap between her detached, monotone professional presence and the fluid, instinctual vitality of Paprika. Her body under stress remains stiff and guarded, a physical manifestation of the psychic armor she wears to navigate the corporate hierarchy. Chiba treats her own physicality as an obstacle to be mastered or a machine to be tuned, yet the film demonstrates that the body keeps the score. The suppressed, vibrant aspects of her personality continuously leak into her waking reality, signaling that her dissociation is a failing strategy. Chiba engages in a cycle of repetition compulsion, utilizing the dream world to perform the very identity she deems unacceptable in reality. By acting as the dream therapist, she repeatedly immerses herself in the volatile emotional states of others, an attempt to manage the chaos she denies within herself. This process is fundamentally avoidant, as it allows her to observe and treat manifestations of subconscious turmoil while maintaining a safe, observational distance from her own. Every dreamwalk is an effort to exert control over a psychic landscape that she fears will consume her if she allows it to exist within the light of her waking consciousness. The emergence of the antagonist, Chairman Inui, and his assistant Himuro, provides the mirror required to expose the fragility of Chiba's coping mechanism. The chairman acts as the literal manifestation of her own repression, embodying the desire to force reality into a singular, static, and authoritarian framework. While Chiba attempts to manage her trauma through controlled compartmentalization, the chairman seeks to destroy the dream realm entirely, viewing its fluidity as a threat to his absolute order. This dynamic forces Chiba to confront the fact that her own rigid self-regulation is merely a different form of the same destructive impulse that drives the villain. Ultimately, the film posits that true agency arises only when the character ceases to treat the body as a prison and the subconscious as an enemy. The moment of Chiba's catharsis occurs when the boundary between the clinical researcher and the vibrant dream agent dissolves. She accepts the shadow, the repressed, and the irrational as essential components of her personhood. By integrating these pieces, she moves past the trauma of fragmentation, demonstrating that health is not the absence of the shadow and the antagonist. Satoshi Kon's Paprika serves as a profound inquiry into the fragility of the unified ego, proposing that the modern human condition is defined by the necessary friction between our waking social identities and the volatile, unfiltered landscapes of the collective unconscious. While the film is often viewed through the lens of a technological thriller concerning the dangers of neurohacking, it functions more accurately as a clinical examination of the psyche's inherent refusal to remain contained. By collapsing the barriers between dream and reality, the film forces a confrontation with the repressed elements of the self that society demands we discard. Central to this psychological exploration is the antagonism between the protagonist, Atsuko Chiba, and the manifestation of her own fractured subconscious, Paprika. Paprika represents the liberation of the libidinal self, embodying the traits that Atsuko, a disciplined, rigid, and deeply clinical psychotherapist, actively suppresses to function within the corporate environment of the DC Mini project. The antagonist, Chairman Inui, acts as a regressive projection of this repression. His desire to merge all consciousness into a singular, dream-bound nightmare is the ultimate culmination of a failed ego. Inui interprets the chaotic nature of dreams not as a chaotic expression of humanity, but as a dangerous vulnerability that must be dominated and codified. His worldview is logically consistent within his own epistemological framework. He perceives the objective world as a site of moral decay and disorder, viewing his plan to force the world into a permanent, controlled dream state as a necessary act of preservation. He is a pragmatist of the absolute, seeking to resolve the inconvenient messiness of human difference through totalizing assimilation. This struggle is mirrored by Detective Toshimi Konikawa, who serves as the character placed in the same existential trap as Atsuko. While Atsuko hides behind the compartmentalization of her dual roles, Konakawa is physically tethered to the trauma of his past. His inability to complete his film represents a fundamental arrest in his psychological development. Where Atsuko attempts to resolve her internal schism by eventually merging her two selves, Konakawa must reconcile his present identity with the ghost of the version of himself that failed to save a friend. His journey through the dreamscape is a process of integrating the shadow, the aspects of his past, his grief, and his artistic aspirations that he had deemed incompatible with his life as a cynical, rational investigator. The relationship between Atsuko and her colleague, Dr. Tokita, provides the film's crucial counter-narrative to the parasitic dynamic of the antagonists. While Inui seeks to feed on the collective consciousness of society, Tokita acts as a grounding force, albeit one defined by a childlike lack of social ego. The symbiosis between the brilliant, naive scientist and the stoic, burden therapist is what allows for the final integration of the self. Atsuko's projection of her own insecurities, specifically her fear of intimacy and her discomfort with her own suppressed desires, onto others is dismantled as the DC Mini's failure forces her into vulnerability. The film utilizes the medium of animation to map this psychological territory with visceral precision. The VFX of the dreamscape do not merely serve as spectacle, they function as a visual manifestation of the psyche's refusal to be silenced. When the boundary between the internal and external dissolves, the world becomes a fluid, shifting collage of cultural anxieties and personal symbols. This spatial psychology reveals the shadow not as a dark, unreachable abyss, but as a vibrant, noisy, and inescapably honest facet of the individual. The ultimate synthesis presented by Paprika is that reality is not an objective constant to be protected from the dream, but a collaborative performance between the conscious and the subconscious. By the time the film reaches its conclusion, the ego's mandate for order is replaced by an acceptance of the inherent, chaotic complexity of the human experience. The transformation of Atsuko into a whole, integrated being, one that acknowledges the dream as a component of the real, offers a trajectory of existential hope. It argues that the struggle to reconcile the self is not a bug in the system of human consciousness, but the very mechanism by which we define our humanity. In the end, the film suggests that we are at our most capable not when we achieve total control over our internal landscape, but when we learn to navigate the shifting, often terrifying tides of our own repressed depths. The collapse of the dream into the waking world is not a disaster, but a long overdue invitation to integrate the totality of the human spirit. The visual proof of the psyche. Satoshi Kon's Paprika functions as a profound inquiry into the fragility of the unified self when confronted with the boundless, uncurated architecture of the collective unconscious. The film argues that human identity is not a static monolith, but a fragile construct held together by the thin veil of consensus reality and the rigid categorization of waking life. By positioning the DC Mini, a device designed for therapeutic dream intervention, as the primary catalyst for the dissolution of these boundaries, Kon illustrates that the human psyche is inherently permeable, susceptible to the infectious nature of shared desires and repressed traumas. The film's central tension arises from the breakdown of the divide between the objective world and the subjective dreamscape. At the onset, the characters operate within a framework of professional detachment. The scientists and detectives view dreams as data to be mined or psychological debris to be cleaned. This epistemic confidence, however, is a defense mechanism. As the narrative progresses, the dream world begins to bleed into the physical city, manifesting as a surrealist, relentless parade of consumer goods, religious iconography, and fractured memories. This visual overflow demonstrates that what we define as reality is merely a temporary agreement. Once the subconscious is liberated from the constraints of the ego, it claims the urban environment as its own, turning skyscrapers and crowded intersections into fluid, malleable spaces. The protagonist's internal fracture is best realized through the dynamic between Dr. Atsuko Chiba and her alter ego, Paprika. Atsuko represents the hyper-controlled, clinical professional, a woman defined by her expertise and her ability to suppress emotional volatility. In contrast, Paprika is the embodiment of fluid agency and uninhibited expression. Their existence is not a division between authentic and false, but a necessary symbiosis that allows the individual to navigate both the rigid requirements of a capitalist, technological society and the chaotic truth of the inner self. The trauma at the heart of the narrative, the suppressed fears and ambitions that manifest as the film's antagonist, is a direct result of the character's inability to reconcile these two aspects of their existence. The antagonist, driven by a desire for total, unmediated control, attempts to collapse the distinction between dreamer and dream, forcing a universal consciousness that consumes individual identity. Visually, Kon utilizes the medium of animation to push the boundaries of spatial psychology. In the waking world, the characters are often framed with sharp, geometric lines, trapped in clinical labs or cold, corporate office spaces that emphasize their isolation and role within a professional hierarchy. When the film transitions to the dream realm, these spatial rules disintegrate. The camera becomes liberated, tracking characters through impossible vistas where the architecture of the mind is projected onto the physical world. The transition between these states serves as a visceral reminder of how the psyche attempts to maintain order against the constant, encroaching pressure of its own repressed content. The uncanny nature of the dream sequences, where crowds of inanimate objects and dolls act with human intention, reflects the terror of losing one's unique perspective to the collective hive mind. Philosophically, Paprika serves as a rejection of a strictly materialist understanding of human experience. It posits that the human element is defined not by the body or the data one produces, but by the ability to navigate the tension between desire and restraint. The characters who successfully emerge from the crisis are those who acknowledge the validity of their dreams and integrate them into their waking lives. The final resolution is an act of reclamation. By accepting the messy, illogical reality of their own subconscious, the protagonists restore a form of agency that was previously denied to them by the restrictive structures of their professional and social roles. The craft behind Paprika, its frantic editing, fluid transitions, and explosive use of color, is an extension of its core argument regarding the nature of memory and perception. The film's pacing mimics the rapid-fire associative logic of dreaming, forcing the audience to process information with the same fluidity as the characters. This technical execution creates a sense of profound instability, ensuring that the viewer, much like the characters, cannot rely on a fixed point of truth. The synthesis of this craft and the film's narrative arcs confirms that the ultimate human achievement is the synthesis of the dream and the real. By refusing to isolate the ego from the unconscious, Paprika presents a vision of the self that is robust precisely because it is inclusive of the chaotic, the irrational, and the deeply personal. It is a cinematic assertion that the architecture of our inner lives is the primary landscape upon which our existence is constructed, and that acknowledging this truth is the only path to authentic liberation. Part 4. Philosophical Underpinnings. Epistemology and Discourse. Satoshi Kon's Paprika serves as a profound meditation on the collapse of the boundary between the individual unconscious and the collective digital landscape. While the film is frequently categorized as a psychological thriller about dream hacking technology, it functions more precisely as an investigation into the radical instability of truth in an age of total connectivity. The film posits that when the medium of human experience becomes digitized, the real ceases to exist as a physical baseline and instead emerges as a fragile consensus, easily eroded by the invasive imagery of the human subconscious. The film operates within a reality where the DC Mini, a device designed to allow therapists to enter and navigate their patients' dreams, becomes an instrument of existential dissolution. By granting external access to the internal theater of the mind, the technology obliterates the private domain. In Paprika, the psyche is no longer a walled garden of introspection but a public, traversable space where the distinction between one's private identity and the shared cultural iconography becomes indistinguishable. The film manifests this shift through the visual erosion of architectural and natural forms, which constantly liquefy and merge, suggesting that the structures of logic are merely thin veneers over a primordial, chaotic churn of unfiltered imagery. The epistemology of this world is defined by the loss of the singular, objective witness. Truth in Paprika is constructed through sensory saturation, where the influx of conflicting, surreal, and often nightmarish data makes it impossible for the characters to anchor themselves in traditional reason. The film echoes the concept of Cartesian doubt, yet expands it beyond the individual's mind to the social fabric. Characters cannot rely on their senses because the dream is not a passive illusion but a coercive, active force that reconfigures the physical world to match its own fever dream logic. The film treats this not as a technological glitch, but as the inevitable evolution of a society that has surrendered its internal sovereignty to the tools it uses to interpret its own existence. This dissolution is presided over by the antagonist, Chairman Inui, whose pursuit of a unified, singular reality serves as a cold, authoritarian rejection of the messy, contradictory nature of the human spirit. Inui represents the ultimate epistemic authority, attempting to enforce a rigid, traditionalist order upon a landscape that has moved past the need for such hierarchies. His violence is the reaction of a system struggling to re-establish boundaries against an uncontainable, fluid reality. However, the film asserts that this pursuit of a stable, singular truth is itself a form of pathology. The true power lies with Paprika, the dream avatar who functions as a bridge between the disparate realms of the conscious and the subconscious. She demonstrates that the only authentic engagement with such a world is not to seek a return to a pre-digital or pre-psychological baseline, but to embrace the synthesis of the self. Technically, the film manifests these ideas through a relentless, recursive visual language. The cinematography often utilizes rapid, disorienting cuts and fluid, morphing transitions that mimic the experience of rapid eye movement. The animation does not merely depict dream sequences, it alters the frame of reality so that the viewer, like the protagonist Atsuko Chiba, loses the ability to discern the start or end of the therapeutic session. The integration of high-energy, eclectic imagery, processions of household appliances, statues, and historical figures functions as a visual representation of the noise that overwhelms individual meaning. These scenes prioritize the overwhelming sensory experience over a coherent narrative path, forcing the audience to participate in the same cognitive surrender as the characters. Ultimately, Paprika proposes that the self is a fluid entity, constantly negotiated through our engagement with both our internal shadows and the external world. The film rejects the notion that we are defined by a static ego or a fixed history. Instead, it posits that identity is an ongoing act of curation and integration. By the final act, the merging of the dream and the waking world is not a catastrophe to be solved but a fundamental condition to be accepted. The characters do not return to a pristine reality, they remain, forever changed, in a world where the borders between the private imagination and the public discourse are permanently porous. The film remains a definitive statement on the human condition in the information age, suggesting that while the structures we build to understand the world may crumble, the capacity for the human spirit to integrate the surreal and the sublime remains our only, and most potent, means of navigation. Metanarratives and social theory. Satoshi Kon's Paprika presents a definitive rejection of the notion that the human psyche can be compartmentalized into neat, objective silos. The film posits that the modern self is a fragmented accumulation of hyperreal symbols, wherein the distinction between internal desire and external projection has fully dissolved. At its core, the film argues that the collapse of the grand narrative, specifically the humanistic promise that technology serves as a tool for empirical advancement, leaves the individual vulnerable to a state of permanent dream logic. The DC Mini, a device intended to facilitate therapeutic breakthroughs by accessing the subconscious, instead acts as the primary instrument for the total erosion of the boundary between the private individual and the collective, chaotic mass. The society depicted in the film is one where ideological state apparatuses have shifted from traditional institutions to the fluid, omnipresent medium of the dream space. This is not a world where the ruling class relies on brute force, rather, it maintains control through the cultivation of shared, curated desires. The parade, a recurring, phantasmagoric procession of consumer debris, represents the inevitable convergence of discarded cultural memories, abandoned pop culture artifacts, and suppressed collective anxieties. It functions as a visual manifestation of hyperreality, where symbols and images have supplanted the physical world, creating a feedback loop of meaninglessness that the characters struggle to navigate. The dream world is not an escape from reality, but the hyperactive continuation of it, proving that the tools used to diagnose the mind ultimately provide the architecture for its enslavement. Within this landscape, the protagonist's struggle is defined by a desperate attempt to maintain a coherent ego against the dissolution of the self. Characters like Atsuko Chiba rely on the clinical, authoritative mask of the therapist, yet this persona is revealed as a flimsy defensive mechanism against the encroachment of their own shadow. The film moves through the epistemic fracture caused by the DC Mini, where the logic of the dream begins to bleed into the waking world, rendering traditional categories of truth and falsehood obsolete. The antagonist, far from a traditional villain, operates as a logical outgrowth of this system, seeking to collapse the tension between the waking and sleeping states entirely. This desire for synthesis is the ultimate threat to the individual. It promises an end to the burden of consciousness, yet demands the total sacrifice of agency. The film's craft, its rapid-fire editing, fluid transitions, and vibrant, overwhelming visual density is an essential component of its philosophical argument. Kon utilizes the medium of animation to replicate the non-linear, associative logic of the subconscious, ensuring that the viewer is physically subjected to the same information overload as the characters. The movement of the camera is restless, refusing to settle on a single perspective, mirroring the instability of a world where space and time are subjective constructs. By integrating the synthetic into the everyday, the film renders the familiar uncanny. Ordinary objects are transformed into extensions of the dreamer's inner world, suggesting that reality is merely a consensus hallucination held together by the failing frameworks of modern society. Ultimately, Paprika concludes that the human condition is an irreconcilable synthesis of the rational and the irrational. Rather than seeking a clean return to a stable reality, the film champions the act of integration. The final resolution is not found in the mastery of technology or the triumph of one logic over another, but in the acceptance of the dream as a constitutive element of the self. By embracing the chaos of the psyche, the characters reclaim a measure of autonomy from the systems that sought to categorize and commodify their subconscious. The struggle against the dissolution of reality is, in itself, the act that preserves the human element, ensuring that even in a world governed by symbols, the subjective experience retains its transformative power. Ethics and the moral calculus. Satoshi Kon's Paprika presents a sophisticated moral landscape where the boundaries of the self are perpetually negotiated through the technology of the collective unconscious. The DC Mini, a device designed to bridge the gap between therapist and patient through shared dream architecture, functions as the film's primary ethical crucible. By collapsing the distinction between private thought and public reality, the technology forces a confrontation with the utilitarian calculus of human desire. The narrative centers on whether the integration of disparate psyches, achieved through the annihilation of individual boundaries, constitutes a salvation or a profound violation of the sovereign mind. The film's central ethical dilemma revolves around the tension between the preservation of the individual ego and the seductive promise of a unified existence. The antagonist, Chairman Inui, embodies a distorted form of utilitarianism, advocating for a world where the chaotic, often destructive impulses of the dream state are liberated from the constraints of rational ego maintenance. His logic posits that because human suffering originates from the friction between internal desires and external societal norms, the complete synthesis of all minds into a singular, dreamlike state is the ultimate moral good. In this framework, the loss of individual agency is a necessary sacrifice to eliminate the pain of disconnection. The film, however, rejects this totalizing vision, positioning the maintenance of the individual's distinct, often messy identity as the cornerstone of human moral integrity. At the core of this conflict is the question of non-human personhood and the rights of the digital manifestation. Paprika, as the avatar of Dr. Atsuko Chiba, occupies a space between clinical tool and autonomous entity. Her existence demonstrates that a construct residing within a machine or a dream can possess a distinct ethical weight, acting as a steward for the psyche's health. The film argues that personhood is not defined by biological continuity or physical presence, but by the capacity to provide continuity of care and the ability to distinguish between the constructive exploration of the unconscious and the parasitic consumption of reality. When Paprika navigates the debris of the collective dream, she acts as a bridge, preserving the essential humanity of the dreamer by refusing to let their trauma bleed into the objective world. This leads to a profound engagement with Camus' concept of the absurd revolt. The characters are repeatedly confronted with a universe that threatens to dissolve into a meaningless, nightmarish collage of repressed desires. Rather than succumbing to the nihilism inherent in the loss of their individual boundaries, the protagonists perform an act of active creation. They build meaning by accepting their flaws, their shadows, and the inherent friction of their existence. Dr. Chiba's eventual integration of her dream avatar, Paprika, represents a rejection of the binary between the professional self and the repressed self. By accepting both, she constructs a whole that is capable of exerting agency over the chaos. The moral imperative in Paprika is therefore the assertion of selfhood against the pressure of a frictionless, unified existence. Furthermore, the film tackles the ethics of ignorance with remarkable clarity. The characters who attempt to flee into the manufactured bliss of the dream are effectively choosing a life of totalized, static comfort, a state that mirrors a profound loss of moral weight. To live in the truth, as the protagonists do, requires an ongoing struggle with the discomfort of one's own limitations and the persistent threats posed by the external world. The film argues that this suffering is not only superior to the comfort of the lie but essential for the maintenance of reality itself. By forcing the characters to acknowledge their shadows, the darker, less palatable aspects of their own psyches, the film suggests that ethical living requires a constant, active vigilance. True morality is found in the ability to remain present within the fractured, imperfect reality of waking life, choosing the complexities of human interaction over the simulated perfection of a shared, dream-born utopia. Through this lens, the film asserts that the struggle for individual sovereignty is the only viable response to a reality that constantly seeks to dissolve the self. Determinism, agency, and time. Satoshi Kon's Paprika presents a sophisticated investigation into the mechanics of the human subconscious, positioning the dream state not as a refuge from reality, but as an inescapable extension of it. The film suggests that the boundary between the waking world and the dream world is an artificial construct, a thin partition that inevitably dissolves when technology grants the individual direct access to the raw data of the mind. By exploring the development of the DC Mini, a device intended to facilitate psychotherapy by allowing therapists to record and enter the dreams of their patients, the film establishes a world where the private theater of the psyche becomes a public commodity. This commodification creates an environment where the internal narrative of the self is subject to external manipulation, turning the subconscious into a site of struggle for sovereignty. The human element of the film is defined by the fragmentation of identity, particularly within the dual existence of Atsuko Chiba and her dream persona, Paprika. While Atsuko operates within the professional constraints of scientific research, Paprika functions as the liberated, unrestrained manifestation of her desires and archetypal self. The film proposes that the self is a fluid entity, constantly negotiating its position between social duty and primal instinct. This negotiation becomes perilous when the DC Mini is hijacked, allowing the collective unconscious of a society to bleed into physical reality. Here, the film posits that the normal's world is fundamentally fragile, held together only by the consensus of its inhabitants. When that consensus is disrupted by the unchecked proliferation of dreams, the resulting chaos reveals the inherent volatility of human perception. Philosophically, Paprika functions as an inquiry into the nature of agency in a world where the barriers to one's own inner life have been erased. The antagonist's drive to merge reality with the dream world is a logical, albeit destructive, attempt to achieve total transparency. In their view, the separation of dream and reality is an epistemic prison. By tearing down these walls, they seek to liberate humanity from the constraints of logic and linear time. The film argues that true freedom lies in the integration of these disparate states. The protagonist's success depends not on suppressing the dream world, but on recognizing it as an essential, inseparable part of the human experience. The struggle for agency is thus transformed from a fight for order against chaos into a process of achieving equilibrium between the conscious mind and the shadow. Technically, the film utilizes the medium of animation to reflect the fluidity of the reality it depicts. The editing mirrors the disorientation of a dream, utilizing match cuts and rapid transitions that defy physical laws, effectively forcing the viewer to inhabit a space where the narrative logic is governed by association rather than causality. The visual execution of the parade, a recurring motif of a chaotic, surreal procession, serves as a potent metaphor for the collective unconscious. This scene demonstrates the film's mastery of scale and composition, as thousands of disparate objects and figures coalesce into a singular, overwhelming force that threatens to consume the city. The integration of traditional cell-like aesthetic with fluid digital motion creates a visual language that feels perpetually unstable, reflecting the psychological instability of the characters as they navigate their fracturing reality. Ultimately, Paprika asserts that the individual is not merely a product of their environment, but a co-creator of it. The film dismisses the notion of an objective, static reality, suggesting instead that the world is a collaborative construction of the human mind. The final resolution does not restore the status quo, but rather proposes a state of synthesis. By accepting the existence of the dream as a valid, influential layer of existence, the characters achieve a form of agency that acknowledges the complexity of the psyche. The film concludes with the promise that while the struggle between order and the chaotic unconscious is perpetual, the capacity to integrate these forces is what defines human resilience. The legacy of Paprika rests in its refusal to offer a clean detachment from the internal world, instead inviting the viewer to recognize that the most profound shifts in human experience occur precisely at the intersection of our waking duties and our deepest, untethered dreams. Part 5: The Craft and Illusion. Cinematography and Spatial Language. The visual architecture of Satoshi Kon's Paprika functions as a sophisticated apparatus for dissolving the boundary between the subconscious and the waking world. Through a meticulous application of spatial language, the film's cinematography establishes a hierarchy of perception where the camera acts as an fluid, omniscient participant that mirrors the volatile nature of the dreamscape. In scenes where the DC Mini's power is exerted, the framing frequently employs wide-angle lenses to distort the proportions of the environment, forcing characters into skewed, claustrophobic corners that signal the erosion of their psychological sovereignty. When Paprika navigates these fragmented landscapes, the camera maintains a fluid, tracking movement that mirrors her own fluidity of identity, while the grounded, static framing reserved for Dr. Chiba Atsuko serves to emphasize her rigid, armor-like adherence to professional and social performance. The film's use of camera movement serves as the primary vessel for its shifting emotional tenor. During the transition into the dream parade, the camera adopts a frenetic, erratic energy, mimicking the sensory overload of a collective hallucination. This movement is never merely observational, it is predatory. As the narrative progresses, the camera shifts from a witness to a collaborator in the chaos, accelerating alongside the rapid-fire editing to strip the viewer of a stable anchoring point. By oscillating between these handheld, kinetic sequences and the precise, measured dolly shots within the sterile confines of the laboratory, the cinematography forces a synthesis of the artificial and the organic. The laboratory represents a vacuum of control, captured through symmetrical compositions that suggest a false sense of order, while the outside world is depicted through expansive, deep-focus shots that reveal the terrifyingly porous nature of reality. Color serves as the definitive structural map of the character's internal states. The film utilizes a palette of high saturation, jarring neons to demarcate the dream world, contrasting sharply with the desaturated, clinical blues and grays of the waking corporate environment. When these palettes collide, such as when the dream spills into the Tokyo streets, the color bleed creates a visual dissonance that mirrors the character's inability to parse reality from fantasy. The accent colors, particularly the recurring, vibrant reds associated with Paprika's presence, act as a lighthouse for the viewer, cutting through the overwhelming visual density of the dream sequences. This deliberate chromatic coding transforms the screen into a ledger of sanity, where the intensity of the hue directly correlates to the proximity of the character to their own repressed desires. Depth and negative space are leveraged to articulate the existential vulnerability of the characters. Kon frequently frames individuals against vast, indeterminate backgrounds, empty corridors, infinite dreamscapes, or crowded streets that swallow the human form. This usage of negative space suggests that the characters are not masters of their environment but rather artifacts floating within a larger, more complex consciousness. When Chiba is isolated within the frame, she is often placed against a hard, vertical line, a wall, a doorway, or a computer monitor that suggests a self-imposed prison. In contrast, Paprika is almost always framed with depth, surrounded by layered, chaotic imagery that emphasizes her capacity to navigate and manipulate the fabric of the dream itself. Light serves as the final, critical layer of this technical mastery, acting as a truth-telling device in a narrative predicated on deception. The harsh, high-contrast lighting of the office scenes exposes the brittle, artificial nature of the characters' professional personas, highlighting the fatigue and sharp edges of their lived experience. Conversely, the dream world is bathed in an ethereal, multidirectional glow that suppresses shadows and softens the hard edges of physical objects. This lack of singular light sources in the dreamscape suggests an environment devoid of a traditional moral center or fixed reality. Through these sophisticated lighting choices, the film establishes a visual logic where the clarity of the image is inversely proportional to the truth of the situation. The more luminous and beautiful the dream becomes, the more the underlying structure of reality, and the character's sense of self, recedes into the darkness. VFX, CGI, and the technical uncanny. In Paprika, the technical execution serves as the primary architecture of the narrative, collapsing the distinction between the physical reality of a crumbling corporate research facility and the fluid, hypersaturated logic of the dreamscape. The film achieves a seamless synthesis of traditional cell animation and sophisticated digital compositing, ensuring that the integration of synthetic elements remains invisible even when the visual density reaches chaotic extremes. By maintaining a consistent color temperature and luminous quality across disparate layers, the production avoids the common pitfall of disjointed lighting, where digital overlays often appear divorced from the practical depth of field established in the grounded, lived-in environment of the Tokyo setting. The digital physics within the film operate on a logic of intentional malleability. Objects and bodies within the DC mini-induced dreamscapes do not merely exist as digital assets, they adhere to a heightened, hyperkinetic set of physical laws that allow for fluid transitions. When digital environments, such as the sprawling, shifting vistas of the dream world, interact with solid characters, the rendering of weight and impact creates a tangible sense of presence. The animation of the digital parades and the metamorphosis of the environment retain a grounded sense of mass, ensuring that even as the reality of the scene dissolves into surrealism, the tactile nature of the character's movement remains coherent. This deliberate application of weight prevents the dreamscapes from feeling weightless or inconsequential, grounding the audience in the psychological stakes of the characters despite the impossible geometry of the space. The film adept navigates the uncanny valley by utilizing digital tools to enhance, rather than replace, the expressive capacity of human anatomy. The characters possess a consistent visual language regardless of their form, as the film uses digital deformation to amplify, rather than strip away, human agency. When the protagonist, Chiba Atsuko, shifts into her alter ego, Paprika, the transition is rendered with a level of detail that highlights the fluidity of the psyche. The animation avoids the sterile, frozen quality often found in computer-generated imagery by prioritizing the subtle, micro-movements of expression, the rapid saccadic eye movements and the organic shift of features that breathe life into both identities. This technique ensures that the audience identifies the humanity within the technology, treating the digital persona as a tangible manifestation of an internal, repressed self rather than an artificial construction. The efficacy of the film's visual language is further bolstered by a massive array of invisible effects. Behind the vibrant, maximalist displays of the dream sequences lie sophisticated set extensions and crowd multiplications that establish a sense of scale and encroaching dread. These elements are woven into the fabric of the film so subtly that they dictate the emotional atmosphere without drawing attention to their technical origin. The depth and perspective work within these expansive scenes serve to isolate the protagonists, physically shrinking them against the backdrop of their own collective unconscious. This economic aesthetic, where complexity is deployed with surgical precision, enhances the film's tone of psychological vertigo. The technical craft reinforces the narrative thesis that reality is a construct defined by the observer, as the animation constantly shifts to mirror the instability of the characters' minds. Every frame, whether hand-drawn or digitally enhanced, contributes to a cohesive, immersive experience where the boundary between the technical illusion and the human drama is rendered entirely irrelevant, proving that the medium itself is the ultimate tool for mapping the topography of the human spirit. Audio, rhythm, and sensory manipulation. The auditory architecture of Satoshi Kon's Paprika serves as the primary engine for dissolving the membrane between the DC Mini's dreamscapes and the clinical reality of the Tokyo cityscape. Rather than relying on traditional musical cues to signify shifts in narrative tone, the film employs an aggressive, fluid integration of diegetic and non-diegetic sound that mimics the frantic, logic-defying nature of the unconscious mind. Susumu Hirasawa's iconic, synthesized percussion-heavy score frequently bleeds into the ambient soundscape of the film, transforming mundane office environments or crowded city streets into rhythmic, pulse-driven extensions of the character's internal anxieties. This fusion ensures that the viewer experiences the environment not as a static setting, but as a responsive, volatile entity that breathes in time with the character's psychological fragmentation. The pacing of the film operates through a deliberate manipulation of rhythmic editing that accelerates in direct proportion to the erosion of the protagonist's ego. As Atsuko Chiba descends into the dream world, the cuts become increasingly jagged, mirroring the rapid, associative firing of neurons during REM sleep. This technical choice is not merely an aesthetic flourish, it functions as a sensory representation of the epistemic fracture. When the boundaries between the real and the dreamt collapse, the film abandons linear, steady-state editing in favor of a chaotic, rapid-fire montage. This creates a sonic and visual feedback loop where the background noise of the city, trains, sirens, and pedestrian chatter is sampled, looped, and integrated into the score, effectively suggesting that the characters are trapped within a self-correcting machine that interprets their distress as a structural component of the dream. The sound design is particularly adept at utilizing audio perspective to dictate the character's internal focus. During moments of profound dissociation, the audio mix often compresses, muting the external world to place the viewer directly within the subjective headspace of the subject. In these instances, the ambient roar of reality vanishes, replaced by a singular, sharp sound, the ticking of a watch, the rustle of clothing, or the uncanny, rhythmic chanting of the parade, which serves to anchor the viewer to the specific psychic trauma being processed. By isolating these sounds, the film forces an intimate proximity to the character's core wound, stripping away the comfort of external information and confining the narrative to the immediate, visceral response of the individual. Silence is deployed as a calculated weapon in the film's most pivotal moments, particularly when the facade of the simulated reality begins to peel away. By plunging the soundscape into an absolute, vacuum-like silence, the film highlights the terrifying emptiness of a world without its shared, mediated illusions. This void acts as a philosophical reset, forcing the characters, and the audience, to confront the absence of objective truth. It is within these quiet intervals that the film achieves its most chilling revelations, as the removal of the rhythmic, synthetic score exposes the stark, fragile nature of the reality the characters inhabit. This silence does not signify peace, but rather the total disintegration of the systems of control, creating a vacuum that leaves the protagonist to face the sheer, unvarnished weight of their own existence. Through this intricate orchestration of sound, Paprika transforms the act of viewing into an immersive sensory experience, ensuring that the technology of the dream is felt as a physical, inescapable intrusion on the consciousness. Synthesis of craft. The technical execution of Paprika functions as a deliberate collapse of the barrier between human perception and digital architecture. Satoshi Kon utilizes the medium of animation to dismantle the traditional rules of cinematography, replacing static physical spaces with a fluid, chimeric geography where the frame itself acts as a malleable psychological construct. By treating the camera not as a stationary observer of a physical set, but as an omniscient participant in a dream space, the film crafts an aesthetic that is perpetually unfolding, mirroring the unstable nature of the human psyche. The lens choices in Paprika prioritize a radical elasticity of depth, frequently oscillating between wide-angle distortions that swallow the characters in a swirling, kaleidoscopic cityscape and hypercompressed close-ups that strip away context to isolate the subject's internal unraveling. This visual vocabulary serves as a direct extension of the film's narrative thesis: the ego is a porous boundary. When the boundaries between the dream world and objective reality dissolve, the cinematography follows suit, discarding deep focus realism in favor of a surrealist fluidity where buildings, faces, and memories overlap within a single field of vision. This technique creates a world that feels both hyper-present and inherently elusive, forcing the viewer to inhabit the protagonist's destabilized epistemological state. The choreography of the frame further denies the viewer the comfort of a fixed perspective. Kon employs rapid, kinetic transitions that treat the screen as a canvas for a perpetual metamorphosis, where characters physically slide, melt, or morph into their surrounding environments. These sequences do more than showcase technical prowess, they visualize the intrusion of the collective unconscious into the singular self. By eschewing conventional cuts in favor of continuous, fluid transformations, the film emphasizes the inevitability of the character's descent into the dream. The camera moves with a rhythmic, pulsating momentum that mimics the flow of subconscious thought, reinforcing the idea that in a world governed by the dream, individual agency is constantly being overwritten by the systemic influence of the collective imagery. The use of color and light in Paprika operates as a sophisticated form of Jungian semiotics. The lighting strategy utilizes high contrast shifts, bright, aggressive saturations that suggest the chaotic vibrancy of the dream self, juxtaposed against the sterile, muted tones of the waking, corporate world. This chiaroscuro does not merely emphasize mood, it acts as a mapping tool for the internal shadow. As characters traverse the threshold between the DC Mini's digital landscape and the physical realm, the light follows the internal logic of their fears and desires rather than the external logic of the sun or artificial fixtures. This manipulation of light creates an uncanny valley effect not just in character design, but in the environment itself, ensuring that even when the characters return to the mundane world, the lighting suggests that the dream has merely become latent rather than absent. Ultimately, the technical innovations in Paprika serve as a technical metaphor for the synthesis of the self. The most visually complex sequences, such as the sprawling, nightmare-fueled parade that consumes the city, represent the complete integration of the digital, the psychological, and the physical. By rendering these impossible movements through a fusion of traditional cel-shaded aesthetics and intricate digital layering, the film argues that technological progress is a mirror of the human mind's own capacity for creation and destruction. The craft does not hide the artificiality of the medium, instead, it embraces the inherent malleability of the image to argue that reality itself is a similarly layered, mutable construction. The film's technical language validates its philosophical argument, because the visual world is constructed through constant modification and synthesis. The human ego is equally fluid, existing only in the fleeting, fragile space between our deepest, repressed shadows and the bright, artificial projections we present to the world. Part 6. Synthesis and Legacy. Synthesis and Legacy. Paprika functions as a profound realization of the boundary between the subconscious and the cinematic image, asserting that the act of dreaming is the ultimate, unregulated medium of human expression. Satoshi Kon's work operates as an architecture of collapse where the digital age's promise of interconnectedness births a total dissolution of the individual ego. By utilizing the DC Mini, a device that grants access to the dreamscape, the film establishes a society where the scarcity of privacy has been replaced by the oversaturation of communal imagery. In this reality, the normal is a fragile consensus, easily shattered by the intrusion of unmediated desire and repressed trauma. The film posits that our digital infrastructures serve as the modern equivalent of the collective unconscious, an expansive, chaotic repository where the boundaries of language and selfhood are perpetually porous. At the center of this dissolution lies the psychological fracture of the protagonists. Dr. Atsuko Chiba represents the performative, stoic intellect of the scientific establishment, a rigid ego struggling to contain the metamorphic, libidinal energy of her dream avatar, Paprika. The conflict here is not between two distinct identities, but rather a struggle for the synthesis of the fractured self. The film's narrative engine is fueled by the shadow, the manifestations of repressed rage and unfulfilled ambition, which, when unleashed via the dream machine, transforms the cityscape into a nightmarish, celebratory procession. This parade is a literalization of the uncontrolled subconscious, a visual metaphor for the failure of the rational mind to impose order upon the chaotic flux of collective memory. The philosophical framework of Paprika rests upon the rejection of a singular, objective reality in favor of a reality defined by the persistence of the dream. Kon suggests that human identity is a nomadic entity, constantly migrating through layers of representation and perception. When the boundaries between the waking world and the dreamscape collapse, the film asserts that truth is not found in the rigidity of the physical, but in the fluidity of the imaginative. The antagonist's logic, rooted in the desire to preserve the purity of the dream from the contamination of human interference, is a radical, if destructive, form of idealism. This philosophy challenges the viewer to recognize that the very act of observing, whether through technology or through the medium of film itself, alters the nature of the reality observed, rendering the distinction between the observer and the observed essentially moot. Technically, Paprika achieves a visual language that mirrors its psychological depth. The cinematography and editing techniques function as a sensory assault, utilizing rapid-fire cuts, impossible spatial transitions, and high-density compositions that force the viewer into the same disorienting state as the characters. The film's aesthetic density, characterized by a vibrant, hypersaturated color palette, serves to heighten the uncanny nature of the dream world, blurring the line between synthetic animation and tactile reality. The sound design complements this by creating a pervasive, rhythmic pulse that bleeds from the non-diegetic score into the environmental soundscape, ensuring that the viewer is constantly immersed in the frequency of the collective dream. The film's legacy is found in its fearless commitment to the elasticity of the animated medium. By refusing to ground its narrative in the limitations of physical laws, Paprika demonstrates that animation is uniquely suited to explore the epistemological crises of the digital era. It serves as a recursive mirror, forcing the audience to confront the realization that their own consumption of media, data, and dreams is an act of co-creation. The final synthesis of the film offers a rare kind of existential hope. It suggests that even in a world where the ego is constantly threatened by the overwhelming power of the collective, the capacity to dream remains a vital, transformative tool. The ending is not a return to a stagnant normalcy, but an acceptance of the continuous integration of the dream into the waking life. Paprika insists that we find our agency not by retreating into the safety of the singular, defined self, but by navigating the tumultuous intersection of the private heart and the public imagination, acknowledging that the dream is the truest, most honest space we possess.